So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Seymour Marine Discovery Center Science Sunday. My name is Jen, and I'll be your host for today's program. Science Sundays are on the third Sunday of every month, except for December, and this is when we invite a scientist, researcher, or conservation leader to speak with you all to provide insight into their research and life as a scientist. Today's Science Sunday presentation will help to further the Seymour Center's mission to show how scientific research plays a role in the understanding and conservation of the world's oceans. Before I dive into today's program and introduce today's speaker, I have a couple of thank yous and event announcements right up top. First off, I want to give a huge thank you to the UC Santa Cruz Fisheries Collaborative Program in partnership with the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Southwest Fisheries Science Center, for sponsoring today's lecture. The Fisheries Collaborative Program is dedicated to advancing the science of fisheries ecology, fisheries resource management, and environmental research as related to marine and freshwater species and their habitats. Due to their generous support, today's lecture is free for everyone to attend. So a big thank you to the Fisheries Collaborative Program. Additionally, the Seymour Center is hosting a few upcoming events that you might all be interested in. Please consider joining us this Thursday, March 25th at 11 a.m. Pacific time for a free virtual lab-side chat with Dr. Suzanne Alonso of UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Suzanne Alonso and I will be chatting about the evolution and expression of mating behaviors in fishes. Find more information on the Seymour Center's website. Last but not least, we have another great event coming up only for Seymour Center members. So Seymour Center members can join us on Tuesday, April 6th at 3:30 p.m. Pacific time for a behind-the-scenes virtual visit to our Rocky Reef exhibit. Pre-registration and details can be found in the member-only portal on the Seymour Center's website. So with all of those thank yous and upcoming events announcements, it's time to now present the reason why you are all here today. Dr. Miles Daniels is here to present Water Management, Climate Change, and Salmon Health, the story of the Sacramento River. Today's lecture will be about 50 minutes long. We'll also have the opportunity to have a short, moderated 10-minute Q&A after the presentation. So if you have a question at any point during the presentation today, please add it to the Q&A feature, and we'll do our absolute best to answer all of those questions in the time allowed at the end of the presentation. I also want to quickly mention that closed captioning is available for folks, so you can see that on the bottom of your screen and make sure that is turned on for a live transcript. Alrighty, so Dr. Miles Daniels is an assistant researcher with the Fisheries Collaborative Program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and affiliate of the National Marine Fisheries Service Southwest Fisheries Science Center, who specializes in environmental and epidemiological modeling of aquatic systems. As an epidemiologist and watershed scientist, Miles combines field and laboratory research, data analysis, and simulation modeling to better understand how environmental conditions impact population health and dynamics. Miles applies interdisciplinary skills to investigate a range of research questions, all with a link between water and health. Most recently, Miles has been studying water temperature and salmon pathogen dynamics in the Central Valley of California to better understand how management actions can impact thermal and hydraulic regimes of waterways and their aquatic ecology. I would like to officially welcome Miles and give him the virtual platform.
Great, thank you so much, Jen. So thanks everybody for coming. It is a really nice day, so maybe after this talk you can go outside and look at the ocean and think about how many salmon are swimming in it. So yeah, I'm gonna jump right in, but basically my goal for today is to look at interactions between climate change, water management, and salmon health. And to do this, I'm gonna use the Sacramento River as a case study. So here is the Sacramento River off to the right. This is a picture of Northern California. And Sacramento River is an incredibly important river in California. It's one of the largest, it drains about 17% of California. If you went all the way to the top of the headwaters and rafted down to where it enters the delta, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, it's about 750 kilometers. So very, very long, very big river. It actually drains portions of Oregon as well. And it's been incredibly important in California's history, both natural and anthropogenic, and it currently is also very important as a water resource. The other way California's Sacramento's river is extremely important is through salmon. So there are lots of different types of salmon that use the Sacramento River. And salmon are an anadromous fish species. So if you don't know what that means, it essentially means that part of their life cycle is spent in freshwater, they go back out to saltwater, and they come back into freshwater. And that's kind of outlined here. I think you can see my cursor. So in the Sacramento River, what typically happens is you have salmon lay eggs up in the headwaters of the watershed, and they basically build a little nest called a redd in gravel. They lay these eggs incubate in cold, clean water for a couple months. They hatch, they spend some time kind of in the redd in their little protective zone as leave-in. They come out of the redd and emerge, and then they're fry. And as they're fry, they kind of are moving through the tributaries and the main stem of the Sacramento River, growing a little bit, eating some insects, etc. Then something happens where they decide to enter some brackish water. And then they start undergoing physiological changes called smoltification to transfer from that freshwater stage to that saltwater stage. They go out into the ocean as adults, spend some time out there, eat a lot of food, grow much, much bigger, and then come back all the way back up the Sacramento River to where they spawned originally, or were spawned, to kind of complete the whole life cycle. So I am not a fish biologist, but this whole thing is pretty amazing to me that these fish have evolved to do this over time. And basically it seems like they're taking advantage of, there's not a ton of resources to grow huge in the river. So they go out into the ocean, get really big, and then bring it back. So it's a pretty fascinating thing. And uniquely to the Sacramento rivers, we have quite a few different runs of salmon. So these are all Chinook salmon, I should mention. And we have about 4 different runs called winter run, spring run, fall run, and late fall run. And this basically corresponds to when they run out of the river during that out migration. So winter run, move out in the river in winter. So it's a pretty amazing thing, salmon. They're very important for the ecosystem. They're also very important for us. They're a great food source. They can be sustainable. They're a huge part of California's economy, but they are also connected to water management, of course. And that's kind of the intersection that we're going to talk about today. And when I'm talking about water management, I'm going to focus a lot on this dam here, which is Shasta Dam up in the northern part of the state that is the largest reservoir in California. But before we kind of focus in on Shasta, one particular example, I think it's good to kind of step back and think about these bigger pictures, these bigger climate things that occur around California to give us more or less rainfall, because that's really driving how we see water resource management in California. So there's 2 slides here. The one on the left is what's called the Pacific North American, or the positive Pacific North American pattern, the PNAA. And the one on the right is the negative Pacific North American pattern. These generally correlate to what you call El Nino and La Nina years, or drier and wetter years. And so these are the 2 big weather patterns that California experiences. And what kind of happens is that essentially during El Nino, or a positive PNA year, you'll have this high pressure zone sitting over California. And you have this low pressure zone in the north that's kind of moved off, as you can see here. And what this does is this high pressure zone basically deflects all these Arctic storms that come down. So they don't really go through the state. They kind of get pushed off away from the state. So we have a little more of a drier meteorology condition. This other scenario, which is La Nina, or a wetter condition, that high pressure moves off in the Pacific. This low comes down from the Canadian Rockies, and it kind of just funnels these storms to come into California. So we get much more rain during the La Nina typically than El Nino, although it's always kind of variable, as we'll see. But these are the 2 big patterns that occur in terms of global circulation around the Earth, and this is how it affects California. I think it's also important to note, though, that there are these massive systems occurring, but also the topography and geography of California is incredibly important. So on the left here, we see a map of the topography and the geomorphic provinces of California. We have this huge central valley, which is green, meaning it's kind of near sea level, a few hundred feet above. And then all this red and white are these big mountain ranges that occur. We have these Great Coast Ranges, this inland Sierra Nevada, and the Klamath Range. And this is really important when we try to understand where precipitation is going to fall in California. And we can kind of see this in this map here, which is on the right, which is precipitation, annual precipitation in California, where dark blue purples are a lot of precipitation, and kind of these beige colors are very little. And so what's happening here is essentially you have these Arctic storms coming down the system. They're full of moisture. What they do, and then when they run into California, they hit these coastal ranges and these other mountain ranges, and they go up in elevation. And there's this process called adiabatic cooling, which basically squeezes all the moisture out of the air and produces rainfall. And this was really exciting to me actually when I first learned about this when I was studying down at CSUMB, because I would be sitting in Monterey looking at a rainfall pattern, and there'd be a storm come through, and there'd be a lot more rainfall occurring in Santa Cruz compared to where I was in Monterey, just 40 miles away. And when you understand this process of adiabatic cooling, it really makes everything come into play. So anyhow, the point here is that we see a lot of spatial variability in California and where rainfall occurs. It's really dominated in the north and much less so in the south. But that's not the entire picture, of course. So it's also very highly variable in time. So from year to year, we get lots of different types of rainfall. We have really wet years and really dry years. What I'm showing here on the left is an example of a very dry year. I think this is 2014. And on the right is a very wet year. You probably can't really make out these figures all that well, but essentially just know that yellows and greens are not a lot of rainfall on an annual basis, and reds and whites and so are a lot of rainfall. And this has direct consequences for, of course, our water resources, right? We have all these dams in the system that capture this rainfall. And this picture down here is showing you the extent that certain dry years can have. So this is a picture of Oroville Reservoir up in the state, northern part of the state, and you can see it's drained very low, and you can kind of see this just by the tree line. You know, it's supposed to be often filled up to this tree line. But I do want to know this is not just one bad year that it has caused this problem. This is during the 2012-2015 drought, this multi-year drought that occurred over year and year and year, and we just kept on tapping into this resource and did not fill it up, and so the reservoir drained. So that's, I think, a very obvious concern to a lot of people is drought in California. But on the other spectrum is we do have issues around too much rainfall sometimes. So in 2017, if you remember, if you're around in the state, it was a massive water year. We had tons and tons of rainfall, and so much that Lake Oroville, which is shown here, same reservoir, different time, could not release as much water as was coming in through the watershed. The managers had to go to an emergency release floodway. There were some issues with that. It started caving and started eroding. And there was a huge public health concern if there was going to be this massive flooding event downstream of a reservoir. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Everybody was okay. But I think it just makes the point that there's these extremes that both have risks in terms of water management. You can have too much water or not enough sometimes. So, right, yeah, and I also think it's important to think about this in terms of just broader than California. We're obviously aware now that California has a lot of variability within the state. But if you look at the nation as a whole, it also has a ton more variability than most other states. So this is some work from Dettinger et al., where I think they looked at rain gauges and they looked at how much variation they saw year to year. And we see these pink colors and yellow colors are kind of low variability, so consistent rainfall each year. And then these greens and these blues and these blacks are a lot of variability, maybe a really dry year, by a wet year, by a dry year, et cetera. And I think it's kind of interesting that you don't even need to know the shape of California almost to pick it out in this figure here, because you can just see it. The state has much more variability than the rest of the nation. And this has some really serious implications for how we've developed our water infrastructure. So based off this variability that we see in space and time, California engineers really realized we need to develop this California water infrastructure that I think is probably one of the most complex in the world, I'd say. And it's made of these series of dams and pumps and canals, basically just to move water around where we want it. So this is another map of California, of course, just to orient yourself. We have circles are reservoirs, dams. The larger the circle, the more storage they can carry. You can see down here is San Lorenzo River. Here's Loch Lomond. It's around 50,000 acre feet of water. What that means is if you filled an acre of water to 1 foot, you could do that 50 times or 50,000 times with Loch Lomond. Shasta Reservoir, which is the largest in the state, you could do that 4.5 million times. It's just a massive amount of water that's stored in Shasta. And typically how it works is we capture water in the rainy season, and then we'll release water from Shasta down through the Sacramento River here. It's just going to flow by gravity until it gets to the delta. And typically it would just go out to the ocean. But because we have lots of populations, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera, further down in the state, we have actually built these massive pumps to raise up the water, pump them into aqueducts that then move them down again through the state through gravity. So it's this really complex system of dams, pumps, canals. There's a lot of work that's done on the Eastern Sierra as well, transporting water to Los Angeles. And it's a pretty amazing complex system that has been developed over the years. And again, just to make this really clear, is it's really designed to move water where it falls to where people live and need it. So this is just a map of the density of people living in California. A lot of it falls in the northern part of the state, and we transport that via dams, pumps, canals, et cetera, down to a lot of people in the southern portion of the state, as well as the middle of the state. So that's kind of a quick overview of water resources in California, how we manage it, how we deal with the spatial and temporal variability. But of course, salmon are using this landscape as well, and this probably has impacts to them. So let's kind of delve into that a little bit. So here's just a kind of a smattering of some impacts that salmon face, some pressures on their populations. Some of them are directly connected to water resources. Some of them are a little more loosely connected to water resources. So we have dams. We're going to talk a lot about this in the next couple slides. This is a clear consequence of water resources. When you're an anadromous fish and you're moving upstream, trying to get to your spawning habitat, if there's a 400-foot concrete barrier in your way, you're going to have a challenge getting through that. Diversions can also have a large impact. It's hard to kind of imagine the scale of these diversions, especially these pumps in the delta, but an interesting way to think about it is sometimes under certain conditions, the water's flowing out through the delta to the ocean. Sometimes we're pumping so much water that that flow is actually reversed and heads towards the pumps. So it's a pretty massive amount of water that we're transferring, and that can have some effects on fish, where they're moving and why. Habitat loss is also very critical. This is not just unique to California, of course. We channelize rivers all around the world so that they can move water quicker downstream to avoid flooding. But as we remove this riparian habitat that kind of slows down water, we remove the complexity of the habitat that the salmon depend on and many other aquatic organisms depend on. So we simplify the system, which likely has an impact on these populations. Disease is also very important, maybe a little more removed from water resources, but still there. And yes, just like us, salmon get disease. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in the talk. Introduced predators are also very important. So there's a lot of non-native fish species in Sacramento River and California in general as well that are eating salmon. And climate, we'll get to kind of at the end of the talk, is also going to have a big impact on water resources, but also salmon. And the connections between these is probably a lot, right? I could see connections between all three of these things and how they interact. And this is kind of the exciting work that we do at the Science Center and the Fisheries Collaborative Program, is look at these connections. We're not just looking at dams or just looking at predators. We're looking at how all these things interact together and trying to find ways to protect salmon populations going forward. So why do they need protection? Their populations, depending on the run, are declining. We do actually have a federally listed endangered species in the Sacramento River, which is the winter run Chinook salmon. This plot here basically explains why they're on the listed ESA list. So we have on the y-axis is run size or population number. You can think about it if that helps. We have time on the bottom. And this is just showing you that their populations have declined quite a bit since the 60s and have pretty much stayed pretty low for the last recent history. And so these fish probably need some help, obviously. And just because they're on the endangered species list does not mean that's the end of the story. The point of being on the list, right, is to make recommendations on how to get them off the list. So that's a lot of the work we do at the Science Center, is try to understand how we can remove these fish ultimately from this list to rebound their populations. Okay, so I want to focus a little bit more on one of those direct impacts to salmon from water resources. And I think the clearest one that probably a lot of us think about are dams. Dams are a direct barrier to a lot of habitat for salmon. This is a nice map put together by the Bay Institute, where essentially you see the Sacramento River, which we're all very familiar with now. And anytime there's a little circle with a little line through it, that's where there's a dam that salmon cannot get past. And all this little dashed blue lines here are habitat that they used to spawn in. And this is important because salmon are cold water fish. Their eggs require really cold water to incubate and survive. And in these headwater streams, you have a lot of groundwater inputs, so that even though it's super hot outside, you have this nice, clean, cold groundwater coming in and sustaining these incubating eggs. And so that's kind of a need for their life cycle. And if you start cutting salmon off at the beginning of their life cycle when they're eggs, that's just going to have a downstream consequence in the entire population. And we can see pretty clearly that this is not something that's just limited to Shasta and the Sacramento River. This occurs a lot of other places as well. And we really have kind of constrained their habitat over time. And I want to make the point that I'm not saying all dams should be removed. Dams provide a very important service, but I also think we need to start thinking about the benefits of salmon health and dams to be able to move forward in a more sustainable way. All right. So why do dams cause such problems for salmon? the real big idea is that they essentially force salmon to move lower into the watershed to spawn. And this essentially changes both the volume or the quantity of water they're exposed to, but also the quality of water as well. And so this figure here, this map is just kind of actually showing air temperature, which is not totally correlated with water temperature, but just to give you kind of a conceptual idea of how air temperature can change in the Central Valley and the Sacramento Basin just by a few, hundreds of kilometers. So historically, winter run Chinook salmon would spawn up here in the headwaters of the Sacramento River, much cooler air temperatures. And now essentially they're forced to spawn down here near the city of Redding, where temperatures go well above 100 degrees in the summertime. And if I didn't mention this already, winter run are kind of this interesting position where they almost entirely spawn in summer. So they're spawning from May to maybe September, October. And so this is during the hottest time of the year, right, in California. And so they're really the fish that are probably getting hit the most by these temperature changes, because they're just spawning low in the watershed where there's really hot air temperatures, and that's going to warm up water. So dams have this impact of forcing salmon to move lower in the watershed. As I mentioned, it changes the volume and the quality of water they're exposed to. And I think we can kind of look at this a little bit more with some empirical data from Shasta Reservoir. So here's a map to orient ourselves. This is the Sacramento River. This is Shasta Reservoir. This green area is kind of those spawning zones. And this figure here, these two figures are just showing you essentially what comes into Shasta Reservoir in terms of the volume of water and the temperature. And so this is a typical thing that we'd see in a Mediterranean climate. We have a lot of flow coming in winter. This is time on the x-axis, by the way, so January, February, March. Flow on the y-axis. So we have a lot of water coming in winter, and then it kind of tapers off as storm season ends, and we have this kind of base flow scenario where we have a lot of groundwater inputs probably sustaining this flow in the upper watershed. So that's flow coming into the system. Down here is temperature coming into the system. Here again, we're kind of seeing a response to climatic drivers. So water temperature is going to kind of just warm up or cool down based off where it's being exposed to in terms of ambient conditions. And in winter, we have short days, cold air, so we have colder water. In summer, we have longer days, warmer air, we have warmer water. So this is kind of just what we would see in a natural watershed anyway, as we move down through the system, is things just warm up over time and space. What we see now, what comes out of the dam essentially, is completely different than the natural setting. And that's the purpose of a reservoir, is to change things, and its purpose is to change the hydrograph. And that's why we have them. And so this blue line is showing you what is coming out of essentially Shasta Reservoir. So now you see that in the wintertime, we have a very low flow scenario. The lowest flow is often in wintertime coming out of the dam. And that's because we're backing up and storing all that water for a later time. And we have the highest releases now in summer, when demands downstream are required the most. So we're releasing that water in summer to meet that demand. So this is ultimately what you would expect in any reservoir to do. This is its function. Kind of a consequence of that is shown down here for water temperature. And now we see we've kind of compressed the variability in water temperature, and we see a really different picture. And what we're seeing is we're kind of just seeing water is being released at around 10, 12 degrees C for most of the year, and then it kind of picks up towards the end over here. And what this is essentially, now that these salmon are forced to spawn down here, they are a federally listed species, the operators of the reservoirs are required to meet certain temperature targets to keep those spawning grounds cold. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So this thermograph here, this signal is because of salmon in dams upstream. And so what's happening is typically we have spawning around May, June, so we're keeping water cold, Then often we might not have enough cold water to sustain that cold water through the entire season. So we tend to see some uptick in waters towards the end of fall before we get a replenishment of rainfall coming into the next water year. So this is just really making the point that these dams are not only just shifting them lower into the watershed, but also changing the volume and the quality of water they're being exposed to. So this is all just empirical data, observed data. Somebody goes out, not anymore, but somebody would go out with a thermometer and measure things. This is all done with sensors now, of course. But we can use models to answer more questions than that. There's certain questions that we have at the Science Center and elsewhere that we want to look into things that we don't have observed data to get at. So instead, what we do is we build a model of the system. And a lot of what we do at the Science Center, where I work, is build physical models of water temperature and use those models to help understand how upstream dam impacts downstream salmon populations. And this is just a kind of schematic of conceptual way to think about what a water temperature model is. The easiest way I like to talk about it is imagine just a parcel of water. You're moving downstream, for example, in a river. If you're a cold parcel of water and you're released in a hot summer day, you're just going to warm up to that water temperature. If you're a warm water parcel and you're released during a cold winter day, you're going to cool down. You're just kind of responding to your environment. And you're responding to your environment based off all these different energy inputs and outputs. And our models are a way for us to kind of characterize all those inputs, which are shown here in all these different lines. So basically, it's just a simple way of us trying to understand what are the inputs, what are the outputs, so we can understand temperature dynamics over space and time in the system. So we can use these models, like I mentioned before, to answer questions that are a little hard to get at with empirical data. And one important question that I'll kind of go into is what's driving temperature on the spawning grounds? So what you see here is kind of a cross section of the Shasta system, where we have Shasta Reservoir up here and the spawning grounds of where salmon are now forced to spawn down here. I'm going to need to explain a little bit about how the system works because it's kind of unique to other systems, so it's important to understand. So we have this reservoir that has a lot of volume storage, and essentially when winter runners are spawning in summer, what happens in a lot of lakes and reservoirs in California is they become thermally stratified. So you have hot water on the top, cold water on the bottom. That's important because the fish need a certain temperature of water. So we might have a lot of water, but if it's all warm, it's not going to do anything for the fish downstream. So we need to make sure we can manage that cold water going downstream. And what Shasta has done, which is pretty unique, or not totally unique, but pretty amazing really, is they've developed this, they put on this temperature control device on the dam. And essentially what this TCD, temperature control device, does, it allows the operators to access different elevations of the reservoir. And so you can access the top of the reservoir and get hot water, or you can access the lower part of the reservoir and get cold water, and you can blend those two. And this is important not just for salmon, but also important for Shasta Dam because it's a power peaking facility. So it generates power through hydroelectricity. And so this TCD allows kind of two goals to be met at once. We can control temperature, and we can also control, force that water through a penstock to generate power. This might be getting into a little too many details, but I think it is important to know. Since Shasta is a power peaking facility, and they're peaking when demand is high and reducing flows when it's low, the hydrograph would just kind of go up and down a lot. You don't want that happening in a river, right? That's going to cause problems for people on boats, et cetera. So what you have is a downstream regulating reservoir, Keswick Reservoir shown here, which kind of smooths out that signal to make it more of a continuous outflow scenario. So essentially, this is where the salmon are spawning. And one of the big questions comes down to is you've got this resource of total volume of water and volume of cold water. And there's kind of two thoughts in my mind of how to use this resource. One is, okay, it's really hot outside in Red Bluff. This is cold water. If we release small volumes of water to the spawning grounds, by the time it gets to the spawning ground, it's just going to warm up too much, and it's not going to be worth it. It's just going to heat up too quickly. So we need to release a lot of water so it pushes down to the system real quickly and stays cold by the time it reaches the spawning ground. The other thought is, well, yes, but the spawning grounds are actually pretty close to where the dam is. So maybe we could release not a ton of water, but a little bit less water, and it would still not, it would warm up, but maybe not enough to have an impact on the spawning grounds. And this is kind of an important question that we try to address with our water temperature models that I'll go into now. Okay, so this map is busy. I apologize. You don't need to look at it all. It was just from some work we did before. Essentially, what you have here is Shasta Dam in this orange, and Keswick Dam, the regulating reservoir downstream. This is the Sacramento River as it goes all the way downstream. This is near Davis. And we can simulate temperature, on a sub-hourly scale all the way down this river. For this analysis, we broke it up into 3 different reaches. So we have reach 1, reach 2, and reach 3. For this talk, honestly, just focus on reach 1. This is where all the spawning occurs in the reach 1. And actually, it's mostly right here above this CCR gauge here. So we really just want to talk about reach 1 today. And what we did is, so we have this model, we broke it out into these reaches, and we want to answer this question: what's driving temperature in the Sacramento River? And so all we essentially do is go through hundreds of thousands of iterations of changing volume or temperature in these different combinations. And this is why we have to use a model for this. We can't ask the operators of the dam to go and iterate through these hundreds of thousands of iterations of changing dam operations. It's not feasible. So we use a model to infer that effect. And so we ran hundreds of thousands of iterations. We use this approach called global sensitivity analysis, which basically tells us what is more important, release volume or dam temperature when it comes to spawning ground temperature. And this is some of the results. So I'm gonna walk you through this, and hopefully it's clear. I apologize if I can't go through it in a more clear way. Again, we broke the river out into 3 reaches: reach 1, reach 2, and reach 3. I'm gonna go into the colors in a moment, but first I think you should focus on the axes. So on the x-axis down here on the bottom, this is how much water volume is being released from the dam. So 200 is a low volume, 800 is a high volume. Don't worry about the units. And then on the left axis, on the y-axis, is the temperature of the water coming out of the dam. So 8 is cold, 15 is warm. And so we just kind of iterated over all these different combinations and saw what was the response in the river by changing these 2 things. And then we kind of binned them by, is it more important the temperature, the volume, or kind of a mixture of both? And that's what this color coding is down here. So if it's blue, it's driven by dam temperature. If it's orange, it's kind of a mixture. And this red color is it's more important, volume is more important. So basically, if you look at reach 1, it's pretty much entirely blue. And a real way to think about this is, let's say I'm releasing 400 cubic meters per second of water out of Shasta, and I release it at 9 degrees C. And I wanna keep it cold. I can do that, but I could also just release 300, a little bit less water, and I would still be in that cold zone. So what this is really getting at is saying that there's going to be some kind of trade-off between the volume and the temperature release. We're not saying volume is not important. Volume is very important. The rate of change is kind of volume driven, but it doesn't need to be super high volumes going downstream. You might be able to get away with a little bit less. And this could have some pretty important implications for how we manage the system for salmon, at least. Okay, so that's an example of how we can use water temperature models to address a question that we really don't have observed data on. And that was just one model of a river temperature model. What we're doing, largely led by Eric Danner, my supervisor, is kind of developing out these broader models that will allow us to simulate watersheds, reservoirs, rivers, et cetera. So now we can understand what's coming into the reservoir, what's going out of the reservoir, and we can model the whole system and look at more interesting effects, perhaps. And we're not just running these in our offices and not sharing them with anybody. Rather, we're trying to develop this website that is a decision support tool for people that make decisions on how to manage the Shasta Sacramento system. It's called CV-Temp, which stands for Central Valley Temperature Mapping and Prediction. If you Googled that web address down there in red, you get there, which is kind of hard to do. So I would just almost say Google CV-Temp and NOAA if you're interested, and it will probably come up. Anyhow, this is a website that you can go to and you can click around and explore. We present a lot of information in graphical format like here to say, oh, what's the temperature coming into the reservoir? How is the reservoir stratifying over time, et cetera. So there's a lot of information there that I encourage you to check out if it interests you. And you can always feel free to ask us questions about it as well. And so now I'm going to give you a kind of an example of how we can use this tool to help inform management kind of on a real-time basis. That first example I gave of the model was more of a research-driven question. This is kind of more, in my mind, a little bit more of an applied management question. Okay, this is going to take a little bit to walk through, I think, but I think it's important to take the time. So let's imagine we're at some point in time in the temperature management season in Sacramento River, which this occurs every year. Every year, agencies have to get together and kind of discuss how best to operate the system to meet all the hundreds of thousands of demands that are on it. And we come up with 2 scenarios, scenario A and scenario B. And they've been primarily developed for a reason not really associated with salmon, but we want to understand how these scenarios are going to impact salmon. So the first thing we can do is kind of come up with an idea of what do we think the spawning locations of these salmon are going to be this year. And so this is just showing this spawning landscape idea. So we have here on the this y-axis, this is going downstream through the river. So the top is at the dam, for example, and you're moving downstream through the spawning ground. The x-axis is time, so you're starting out in winter and moving through to fall. And then these little fish here are kind of an example of, oh, yep, there was a fish that spawned there. And this is all very conceptual, not data, so just keep that in mind. Sorry, my cursor keeps on disappearing, so sorry if I'm moving it around a lot. So this example would be some fish that spawn in spring and was far up in the system, where this example would be some fish that spawned late summer and was further down in the system. And we can evaluate how these different fish are going to be impacted by operations. And the first thing we can do is we can run these scenarios, scenario A and B, through our water temperature models and generate what's called a temperature landscape. So now we've kind of added on another layer of information. Color, which is representing water temperature these fish are exposed to. Blue is cold water, red, white is hot water. And right off the bat, right, you could look at this and say, looks like scenario A is a little colder than scenario B. There's probably some reasons for that. Looks like scenario B is probably not going to be the best for salmon, but can we tell people more? And we can tell people more. We can use this information and our understanding of how salmon eggs respond to water temperature through biological models and kind of integrate temperature models with biological models that ultimately describe how a salmon egg is going to respond to a given operational scenario. So this is a conceptual model pulled from some work from some collaborators at the Science Center. Essentially what you have here is survival of an egg. 0 is low survival, 100 is high survival. On the x-axis on the bottom is cold water. These eggs are being exposed to cold water. These are laboratory studies. And on the right is hot water. And all these dots are just a bunch of different data points. And a model was fit through this. And the point to get from this, though, is that you can see there's this zone of water exposure, temperature exposure, where it doesn't seem to have that much of an effect on survival, right? You could expose them here or here, and it's pretty much 100% survival, or a little bit lower, 80%. But there's this threshold that's hit. And here, whereas as soon as you get a little bit too warm, you see this real clear drop in survival. And that is extremely important if we're trying to manage this species, because you don't want to pass that threshold. And so we can use this type of information to say, well, how actually different is scenario A and scenario B? It might just be a little bit warmer, but that could actually have a big impact. So what we do is we take this temperature landscape that we've developed, we apply this biological model, and then we develop a new landscape called the survival landscape. So these are the same axes. We've just changed the color. The color now does not represent water temperature. It represents egg survival. So red is low survival, blue is high survival. And again, real quickly, you'd be able to look at these two scenarios and say, if the goal is to protect salmon, which there's a lot of other goals when you're talking about Shasta operations, but if it's focused on salmon, looks like you should go with scenario A over B. And again, this is just a kind of conceptual idea. The scenarios we evaluate in real life are not this stark in contrast for the most part, but just to make the point that we can use these tools essentially to help inform managers of how to manage the system. And we're doing this now, right? We do this every year where essentially we get a forecast of what we think the water year is going to be like, and we start planning how should we best use this water. And I say we as in lots of other people, not just me. But we at the Science Center provide some information onto the managers of how these different operations are going to affect salmon, because that's what our kind of charge is. So this is just an example showing you, maybe we have some hindcast periods. So we've been operating Keswick, Shasta up into August, and now there's some other decisions that need to be made, and we need to kind of run these scenarios through our models and say, oh, option A is better than option B, but C is also okay. And ultimately, the goal is to help manage this finite resource that we have available to us and to salmon. Okay. So just checking to see I'm doing time. I think it's okay. So I've talked a lot about essentially what has happened in the past, what's the current setup of California's water infrastructure, how we use these models to understand maybe this season's operational conditions. We can also use these models, though, to understand what's going to happen in the future and how that's going to impact salmon and us who use the water during climate change events. So I'm not a climate scientist, but I like to use their data to feed into models. And I'm pulling a lot of information from California's 4th Climate Assessment Report. If you want to learn more about this topic, I would suggest going there, just Googling it. They do a great job of breaking the state up into different regions. So we have a Central Coast region here, which Santa Cruz is included on, as well as the Sacramento Valley, which we're going to be talking about today. And they provide reports that are very detailed and very technical, if that's your thing, but also some nice summary reports if you just want to kind of get the gist of what we expect to happen. So it's very accessible, and I would definitely encourage you to check it out. I learned a lot. So Climate change, anytime we're kind of talking about climate change, we need to think about terminology, and often you hear RCPs, representative concentration pathways. What do those really mean? So essentially they're a way for us to describe the amount of greenhouse gas and aerosol and land use change we think are going to occur in the future. Today we're going to kind of be focusing on two RCPs, RCP 4.5, which is kind of a medium emission scenario, and then our RCP 8.5, which is high emissions or business as usual. Let's just keep on doing what we're doing. This nice figure here kind of explains how this represents the different emissions across these different scenarios. So here are the greenhouse gases. We've got CO2 and methane, et cetera. We've got aerosols and land use change. The colored bars represent what these emissions are going to be when we forecast out to 2100, so about 80 years from now, which is not that far away, amazingly, at least in my mind. And what we have on the bottom here are these basically watts per meter squared. How much more energy is the Earth going to suck up or reflect back out into space, depending on the RCP that we run. So obviously, business as usual, RCP has really high levels compared to other RCPs. And so the way I like to think about these are basically scenarios that, just like we have Shasta operation scenarios, these are greenhouse gas scenarios. And just like we run our Shasta scenarios into our water temperature models, we can run these in global climate models. And I don't do this, but other people do. And this is just an example of some of the output you can get. So these models are much, much more complex than my little water temperature models that we work with, but they're the same philosophy, same processes occurring. They just have a lot more detail. So this is an example of some of the output we can get. Again, we can run different scenarios of RCPs and say, well, how is this going to affect certain characteristics? Often we think about global surface temperature and how that's going to change. But since these are global models, we can kind of zoom into California and say, well, what do we think is going to happen in California? Which is great, because a lot of these models, they provide the data for you to use. It's a great resource. The issue is that these models are a little coarse, and they're designed to be that way so they can run efficiently. They're simulating the entire globe, layers of elevation, et cetera. You can't have this super fine scale model run out 100 years. It's just going to take too long. And so computationally by a computer. And so often when you look at these models, this is what California might look like in terms of precipitation. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, California's geography has a really large role in precipitation, and these global climate models just don't represent that well. So some really smart people can do what's called downscaling of these results and produce maps and data like this, which is really showing us what we want to know in California. How are these mountain ranges and other things impacting where the rain falls out in 100 years or so. So this is great. We can take these models and run them to understand how climate is going to change. This is just a quick summary of two things that we think are important related to salmon and water resources. I'm not going to go into a lot of details of how we use these to run models just because we don't have time, but I think it's more important to talk about what the conceptual idea is and how we might expect to see these changes. So on the left here, we have maximum temperature, and you can look at it in terms of degrees C or degrees Fahrenheit, depending on what you like. Over time on the bottom, this gray is what has historically happened, and then the red is what's happening under that business as usual RCP scenario, and the blue is the medium emission scenario. So it's pretty clear looking at this. You don't need any kind of test to show that, yep, we are going up in temperature, but it does look like we can do something about it. We can kind of level off if we really try to reduce our emissions. So that's hopeful in my mind. But this is going to be important because as under a warming climate, water temperatures are going to warm quicker. This is going to impact salmon eggs more. You're going to need more cold water essentially to deliver the same amount of protection. This figure off to the right is precipitation on an annual basis. I don't get a whole lot out of this except for the fact that there's a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. And that's kind of what the climate models predict, is it's just going to become more volatile. And for a state like California that has a huge amount of variability, it might just become more variable, which any water resource engineer is probably going to say that's not great for managing water, because you need to know, have an idea of how much is going to come to conserve it. So what are some of the summaries of this California climate assessment? I kind of took their summary table and kind of added on a little column that talks about, does this maybe impact salmon? Mostly yes. So for temperature up here, yes, we think temperature, the direction it's going to go is warming, like we just saw in the last plot. We have pretty high confidence in that unless we change things. That's going to obviously impact salmon and water resources. You're going to have diminished cold water. Sea level rise, it's going to likely occur. This is probably going to impact salmon, but also probably really impact California water infrastructure more, perhaps. It's pretty important, as many of us live by the coast that know that. Snowpack is another factor that's going to come into play. Snowpack's like a natural reservoir. That's going to probably go down under these forecasts. They have pretty high confidence in that. Many of these salmon require these snow-fed systems to survive, so that's going to be another stressor on them. Heavy precipitation events. We didn't really talk about this a whole lot, but there are these, probably you've heard of them, these atmospheric river events that occur that drop a ton of rainfall in a very small amount of time in a very localized location. This can cause problems for water resource management, as we saw in 2017 in Oroville, and also probably will impact salmon in some way or the other. Drought, of course, is going to be important. Less water for fish means probably less fish. And lastly, wildfires. Excuse me. We're all probably more than familiar with wildfire risk now in Santa Cruz County, but it is expected to increase, and this will have an impact on salmon. As these watersheds are burned, there's more erosion that occurs and can impact different life stages of salmon populations. So it seems like there's a lot of things going on. One thing that's not specifically mentioned here, which I'll get into very quickly, is disease. As Jen mentioned, I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and so I wouldn't think I'd be doing my field justice if I didn't put one of these figures up, which is the epi triad. And this is just the way for epidemiologists to think about how hosts, pathogens, and the environment interact. We know it's not always just about the host or the pathogen and the environment. It's this interaction between these three core groups that really is important when you're trying to understand risk from some kind of change, like climate change. And so if we think about this in terms of salmon, we can think about them as the host of getting sick. That, depending on their age or their sex or their run, they might have different susceptibility to different types of pathogens. Those pathogens themselves might have different virulence depending on the environment they're in. And so there's this whole interaction that occurs, not just with salmon diseases, but any types of disease. And so understanding how these processes interact is very complicated, very difficult to do, but something that is worthwhile doing, as we're all probably aware now this year. So what are we doing? We just started up a project at the Science Center and through the Fisheries Collaborative Program to kind of better understand the role of disease in salmon. And this is really building off a lot of work that people have already done. There's a lot of people in the system, such as Scott Foote, who works at the California Nevada Fish Health Center, has been studying disease for a long time in salmon. We're just trying to bring more people into it and kind of look at the problem in a little bit more ways as well. So what we're doing essentially is trying to collect empirical data on pathogens and salmon disease and build a model from that. So quickly, what we do is we go out to the river and we collect water samples to take them back to the lab and say what kind of pathogens are in them. That's what salmon are exposed to. That's what we need to know. We also put fish out in cages in the river. So we can just hold them in one location, let them be exposed to ambient river conditions for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, and then take them back to the lab and say what kind of pathogens are they having? What kind of disease outcomes do they express? And then we can also collect wild fish too, through the help of, for example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Red Bluff Office, to understand what about wild fish that are moving through the system? What kind of pathogens are they exposed to? And ultimately, we can bring all this information and build a epidemiological compartment model shown here, which is basically trying to break out the population into kind of 3 or more groups, depending on your model. You might have a population that is susceptible to disease. So maybe this is a fish. It's susceptible to getting some kind of pathogen, but it also depends on the temperature exposed to, et cetera, other interacting conditions. It gets sick, so it gets infected. And then depending on maybe it was exposed to a lot of pathogens or not that much, or really hot water or not much water, or maybe there were some other things going on, it might get removed from the population and die. So these are just ways for us to understand how a salmon moving downstream to the river, being exposed to certain pathogens at certain times of the year under certain environmental conditions, is going to be, it's going to express that in health outcomes. And so hopefully this will help us understand current risk of disease in salmon, but also we can use these models with our water temperature models to look at future risks as well. Okay, so I think I'm about done. I know a lot of this has probably been kind of not the most uplifting information, to be honest, but I don't want to end on a sore note, and I am actually very confident that we will do better. And this is a nice figure from the Bay Institute, which basically shows you how much water you can save under current operations by just improving efficiency and conservation. And in my mind, and this is just my personal opinion, this has always been a kind of the approach that I think we should all take, in the sense that, yeah, we can build more dams, we can build more desalination, we can do all these things that cost a ton of money and a ton of time, or we can just try to use a little less water and use it a little more efficiently. And maybe we can do that and give more water back to the environment. And we're probably going to see benefits from that as well, too, because anytime you go to a nice watershed where there's tons of salmon, it's a healthy environment. You're going to benefit from that mentally. You also benefit from ecosystem services such as clean water, clean air, clean food, healthy food. And so I think it's this really big approach that I'm not the one, making it up. I've just listened to people that know a lot more about this, and it makes a lot of sense to just try and conserve what we have and plan going forward, because we do live in a state, obviously, where we have a lot of variability in climate, and water resources are going to probably continue to be limited. Okay, so real quickly, I just want to thank a lot of the contributors, especially around all the water quality and quantity modeling. There's a lot of people working at this at the Science Center and the Fisheries Collaborative Program, kind of led by Eric Danner. And again, this is the nice thing about the Science Center and the Fisheries Collaborative Program integration, is we get to work with federal scientists and UCSC scientists to answer all these difficult questions. And it's been pretty exciting to do that. And then, of course, with the salmon pathogen disease modeling that I just mentioned, the program actually just started this year. I did not think I was going to start a project on pathogens during a pandemic. It's made things challenging, but we've actually been able to pull a great group of researchers from places like Oregon State and Davis and others to bring together our expertise and try to address this really challenging problem, at least trying to understand if there is a problem. And that's it.